I am thrilled that you are joining us for this very special Friends at Home event. Tonight, we are in for a treat. We will be talking to Saket Soni, about his book, The Great Escape, published this January. My name is T.C. Curry, and I am with the Friends of the Alameda Free Library in California. Before we get started, I would like to review a few technical details. This is a live webinar and it is being recorded. So the audio for the audience is muted and your video is turned off. So you will only see myself and the speakers. Please use the chat to introduce yourself and tell us where you're zooming in from. We love to see where you all are coming from. We will answer any questions towards the end of the program. So drop all of your questions into the chat. We monitor the chat and ask that all participants act with respect in their comments. The recording will be available in a couple of days on the Friends YouTube channel. Before we get going, I would like to tell you a little bit about the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. We are a nonprofit organization that raises funds and advocates for our academic life in the lovely city of Alameda, California. These Friends at Home events are free, but you won't be surprised to learn that we appreciate donations. Thanks to our supporters and their ongoing donations, we can continue to honor our commitments to the library and to support events both online and in person. We ask that you consider a donation to the Friends in any amount that is comfortable because everything helps. You can give via our website at alamedafriends.com or use the link you will see in the chat. And now on to our program. In late 2006, Saket Soni, a 28-year-old Indian-born community organizer, received an anonymous phone call from an Indian migrant worker in Mississippi. The worker was one of 500 men trapped in a squalid Gulf Coast man camp, surrounded by barbed wire, watched by guards, and crammed into cold trailers with putrid toilets, forced to eat moldy breads and frozen rice. Recruiters had promised them a good job and green cards. The men had scraped together $20,000 each for this opportunity. After Katrina, leaving their families in impossible debt. During a series of clandestine meetings, Soni and the workers devised a bold plan. In The Great Escape, Soni traces the workers' extraordinary escape, their march on foot to Washington, D.C., and their 23-day hunger strike to bring attention to their cause. Along the way, ICE agents tried to deport them, company officials worked to discredit them, and politicians averted their eyes. But none of this shakes the workers' determination to win their dignity and keep their promises to their families. Saket Soni is the executive director of the Resilience Force, a national voice of resilience workers, workers whose labor helps prepare us for and repair after climate disaster. He is also a member of the board of Greenpeace, Inc. By the way, we are putting a link to the book into the chat where you can purchase it from our local store, Books, Inc. So welcome, Saket, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. What a pleasure to be here. I am thrilled to be talking about this book with you.
Can you start us off by reading a passage from your book?
Yeah, sure. I will start by reading the prologue. I will turn my blur off for a second to show you the book. There it is, The Great Escape, a true story of forced labor and immigrant dreams in America. And I will read from the prologue. The Call, November 10th, 2006, New Orleans, Louisiana. When my parents called me the night of my 29th birthday, I was lying in wait for a human smuggler. I pried open my phone, barely feeling my fingers from the cold, and sent them to voicemail with a silent apology. I hadn't called home in months. This was regrettable, irresponsible, but they could sit tight for a few more hours. In Delhi, where they were, my birthday had already passed. I was in an unheated car parked 2 blocks from the Home Depot on Claiborne, on an unlit street I couldn't name. In Central City, street signs were still twisted and torn from the flooding after Hurricane Katrina. My sights were trained on Javier Ruiz. He was across the street, standing next to a 1-ton dumpster overflowing with construction debris. I squinted to read his expression, but could only see his outline, stocky and stoic in a zippered hoodie. He had to have been freezing, but he remembered my advice and kept his hands in plain view, holding the plastic bag that contained the ransom money for his kidnapped nephew. $20,000 to $2,000, sorry, to be handed over after delivery. No nephew, no money.
Thank you. That's one of the things that I just thoroughly enjoyed about this book is that it really it reads like a Tom Clancy thriller. And I just, it's just on the edge of your seat the whole time. It's amazing. So I think when we hear of human trafficking, most of us think of young kids being trafficked into sex slave situations, but these men are highly skilled tradesmen, and it's a whole different world. And so can you talk about how the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina really changed things in this realm?
Yeah, well, the book starts just a few months after Hurricane Katrina. I was a labor organizer running a small nonprofit. My job was to protect the workers who were doing all the rebuilding. Now, the hurricane and the flooding that followed had turned the Gulf Coast into the world's largest construction site. And the people doing the rebuilding were all these immigrant workers, workers like Javier Ruiz, right at the beginning of the book, the gentleman I just read about. The book starts when I get this mysterious midnight phone call. When you're a labor organizer, your job is to solve workers' problems. And that night, I was solving a particularly big problem. I was helping a Honduran day laborer ransom his kidnapped nephew. And we managed to do that. And I got home and I had a celebratory birthday drink of Bushmills whiskey and collapsed in my call. And that's when I got this call from, collapsed on my couch. And that's when I got this phone call from a man who was too scared to tell me his name or where he was. But I could tell from what he was saying that he was trapped and in complete control of a company. He was working in Mississippi, and it turned out he was from India. And I wondered, what was an Indian man doing just having arrived in the post-Katrina Gulf Coast? All of these immigrant workers were, from all over the United States. Most of them were Latinos, many from Mexico, many from Honduras, but this was the first Indian worker that I had talked to. It turned out he was one of 500 Indian workers who was sold an American dream in India. Recruiters went to India on behalf of a giant oil rig company and promised these men green cards and good jobs if they would come to the United States. They had to pay $20,000 a piece for this opportunity. Now, that's a lifetime of savings in India, or generations of savings. So the men sold ancestral land, they emptied their parents' pensions, they sold jewelry that had been in their possession for generations, and they took extraordinarily high interest loans. They packed their bags and came, all in the promise of an American dream. It turned out they'd been trapped into an American nightmare. They were living 24 people to a trailer in sardine can trailers on a labor camp on company property, surrounded by barbed wire, guarded and surveilled 24 hours a day. They, had nothing but frozen rice to eat to sustain themselves. They were paying rent, $1,000 a month in
Give him a
rent.
second to see if he comes back.
Go ahead.
So that's how I found these workers. It turned out that, there were never any green cards. The men had been recruited to come on temporary visas for which they had paid $20,000 apiece. And it turned out that, I had stumbled upon one of the largest cases of human trafficking in modern US history. So the book is about my relationship with those men and how we engineered this great escape, not to give anything away, but it sort of an escape out of something like a heist film that involved lots of wild turkey whiskey as bribes to the security guards, flavored cigars as bribes to the security guards, and the pretext of an elaborate fictitious Indian wedding, which formed the cover for the men to come out of the labor camp in the middle of the night and set out on something like, a half freedom journey, half American chase thriller.
One of the things that I found really interesting in the arc of the book is the role that food has in getting them in to trust you. And because, in the beginning, they didn't really trust you. But then it's an arc that I just found really interesting that sort of flavors the whole book. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that was a really interesting part of the story. Fundamentally, in the labor camp, one of the greatest indignities and difficulties the men faced was, they just didn't receive any food. They wanted good, hot food to sustain themselves, and all they got was frozen rice. When I met the men, I initially tried to get them to trust me. The first meeting I had with them was a meeting where I expected 3 men to meet with me anonymously in the back of a church. I opened the door and there were 100 men waiting there for me. And I started in on a labor organizer's speech and it fell flat on its face. The men didn't want, a young Indian American labor organizer. They wanted an American attorney in a suit to tell them how they were going to get free, how they were going to get the green cards that were promised to them. And so the meeting dispersed. I thought I would never see the men again. But then a man from inside that crowd, a man named Rajan, called me. He secretly made contact with me and agreed to meet with me clandestinely. And I explained to him that the kind of visas these men are on never turn into green cards, that this whole thing was, a fraudulent scheme meant to extract free work from them. So Rajan and I became uneasy allies and then friends. We were very different, but we became friends. And food formed our relationship. At the time, I didn't know how to boil an egg. I couldn't cook to save my life. But he had me smuggle him Indian ingredients, spices and ingredients into the labor camp. And the way he convinced the men to listen to me was that he commandeered the cafeteria in the labor camp and started cooking them meals. And these meals, these simple but wonderful Indian meals, dal, lentils with mustard seeds swimming in oil, simple pan-fried chicken. These wonderful meals woke the men up from a hopeless catatonic state and roused them back into a kind of relationship with life. And that's how Rajan convinced them to come meet with me. So he ferried them out of the labor camp. We would meet, we would eat in these secret hotel rooms. And as we set out on our journey, as the men escaped from the labor camps and set out on the road, Rajan and I became deeper and deeper friends. And every friendship has its rituals, and our ritual was food. In fact, there's a at the apex of the campaign, we're in Washington, D.C. We've reached an extraordinary obstacle, and each time we reach an obstacle, we cook together. And in this instance, Rajan made a mouth-watering one-pot meal, rice and chicken in a huge pot with 22 spices. And it's just this like mouth-watering meal, an extraordinary meeting over food. And it jogs loose the next solution in the campaign. So there's a lot of food in the book, because food both was such a deep part of my friendships with these men, and it, along with the friendship, sustained us through this really difficult journey.
As food is done throughout history, but I really enjoyed that part of it. It's how long did it take you to convince them into escape? Like once they started eating and they got their energy back, because they're being ferried out to oil rigs in the Gulf to work all day as, not carpenters, but welders, and like really heavily work.
It took a while to convince them. The men were really desperate for the company's scheme to work. Of course, the company's scheme was completely fraudulent, right? These men, though, experienced extraordinary pressures. They were here all alone. They'd left wives and children and parents and brothers and sisters behind. They'd borrowed all of this money and now had moneylenders, circling their families. So the pressure in India was rising and rising. The pressure for them to pay these debts back, the pressure for them to work. So the hardest thing to convince them of was to get them to stop working and escape from the labor camps and get on the road into and march into an uncertain future. But partly the food convinced them, and partly Rajan and I convinced them by showing them that all the promises that the company had made had fallen apart. And they, when they realized that, then they started to get on board.
Well, and what were some of the injustices? I mean, you talked about the frozen rice, which is, it's not just that they had frozen rice, it's that they had no way to cook the rice. So, I mean, it's like, it's levels of indignities. It's like, we're just going to give you this really awful bread and this rice that you have to unfreeze by putting it in your mouth before you can even eat it. I mean, they're wildly undernourished. I mean, one of the things I was just enraged about is I did a quick calculation, and 20,000 times 500 men is $10 million.
Not only that, that's just the money they paid
to get here. Then
they were paying, then it was 500 men paying $1,000 a month in rent to live in the labor camp. So that was millions more. And that was really the profit model. The company had worked out, the men emptied their families' coffers,
right,
and sold ancestral land, to buy an American dream that turned out to be a lie. The recruiters made millions and millions of dollars. The company got itself some of the best pipe fitters and welders in the world at a fraction of the cost of American workers. And so everybody won except for the workers. That was really that was really striking. The deepest injustices, though, were the ones that I learned of when I got to know the men really deeply. For example, there was a man named Ebi Raju. Ebi was a young motorcycle riding, 20-something kid in India who never wanted to get married. He just wanted to be free. He wanted to roam. He wanted to probably date. And he wanted to get back out into the Middle East, where he had spent 5 years, and earn more money to afford his parents a retirement. So Ebi comes home, from the Middle East before he comes to America. Ebi comes home, and his mother drags him into an arranged marriage. He doesn't want to get married, but his mother's dragging him into it. And Ebi happens to speak to his bride-to-be on the phone. And upon hearing her voice, he falls in love with her. So then Ebi agrees to get married. And now he has a new problem. How is he going to tell his wife, that his bride-to-be, that he's going to leave for the United States shortly after, just weeks after the wedding? So that's Ebi's situation. Now, Ebi gets to the United States, and he's high on top of an oil rig when the phone rings. When he left his wife, she was pregnant. And that phone call is, she's calling him to tell him she's about to go into, she's going into labor. So Ebi asks his supervisor if he can go home to India, to be with his newborn child. The company says no. And so Ebi doesn't see that child until that child is 3 years old. It takes 3 years for Ebi to be reunited with his son. Those are the deepest injustices, the ones you can't see. There's another man named Gyani Gurbinder Singh. He's a welder, but he's also a priest of the Sikh religious faith. And he comes to the United States with this glorious inkjet beard. It's like a point of pride. And the company tells him that if he doesn't shave it off, he will be deported back to India. Now, there's no reason for that, at all. But he can't afford to be deported. He can't afford to return to the debt that he's put his parents in. So he shaves his beard, but as a result, he does not send pictures home to his family for the next 3 years. So those were really the deeper injustices, you see, that, that I heard about. And I think those injustices are really why the workers went on this road, why they took such an extraordinary risk to escape from the labor camps.
That makes a lot of sense. How did they actually escape?
Well, I don't want to give any spoilers, but
okay, that's fine.
But I'll give you, the teaser, which is that, and I said a little bit of this while you were frozen. It took a lot of flavored cigars and wild turkey whiskey as bribes for the security guards, and it took the pretext of an elaborate but completely fictitious Indian wedding that gave us the cover to get the men out of the labor camp.
So you've got the men out, and did all 500 come out?
Most of them. Some elected to stay with the company, but most of them, yes, they did come out. Yeah.
So, and you've decided to march to Washington, and on this trip, which is a fascinating book all in itself, you connected them with labor organizers, and especially from the African American community, as you were going on this journey, and allowing them to connect with them and the wisdom that these sort of OG organizers had accumulated over the years. Can you talk about that? And especially since they were told that African Americans were scary people when they were in the camp, right?
Well, the company, used lots of tactics to keep the men inside the labor camp, right? Fundamentally, forced labor and human trafficking means you're not free to leave. And these men were tied not by chains to their company, but by debt, the extraordinary debt, by their racial isolation, their linguistic isolation, but also the company made them afraid of stepping out. You know, the outside was full of ICE agents and the police, and they used these sort of racist images of African Americans. They mobilized these racist images of African Americans to keep the men in the labor camp. I was outside though, and I'd arrived in New Orleans, and I had the incredible fortune of being mentored by these extraordinary African American organizers, veterans, veterans of the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and others, who really taught me what it was like to organize in the South, and particularly in the Deep South in Louisiana. So these were my mentors, and when the men escaped and came outside, they became the mentors of these men. So there was, an organizer named Ted Quant who, years before had been the, first Black shop steward in the union that represented at the time America's largest sugarcane factory. On our way to Washington, we met with civil rights organizers, including a mentor of mine named Reverend Nelson Johnson, a man who, led a truth and reconciliation process in North Carolina after a racist massacre. So this was the journey the men were on. This was really important. It wasn't just symbolic. As we set out to Washington, what we didn't know was that deep inside the federal government, there were nefarious agents who had their own corrupt ties to the company, law enforcement agents with corrupt ties to the company who were dismantling our campaign even as we were beginning it. And meanwhile, these men from India, the immigrants from India, they had a very rosy view of the U.S. government. They they thought that, they had more faith in the US system and in American government than most American-born people. And the important thing that African American organizers supplied was a real clear, a real clear-eyed picture of what it means to go up against the federal government, and what it's like in the South where law enforcement is so allied with companies, even though they represent the government. All of that was political lessons we gained from African American organizers in the South.
Yeah, and yes, you're marching to Washington, but here's a dose of reality on what you can expect.
That's right.
And you were followed when these almost 500 men are marching from Louisiana or Mississippi to Washington, D.C. And then you start realizing that there are people that are following you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we realized that there were people surveilling us from high on top of buildings in Alabama. We chased them down and followed them to something that looked like a parked construction contractor's truck. I thought I was chasing down, white vigilantes, Minutemen. I would always encounter these people who, took it upon themselves to surveil and patrol places where immigrants worked. I opened the back of the van, however, and the person I found wasn't just a white vigilante. This was the Alabama director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, of ICE. And we learned that there was a nationwide dragnet that was surveilling these men. And as our journey proceeded, we would come to learn that it was all controlled by this mysterious figure who winds up in the book. He's a character in the book, who's sort of working to bring down this investigation, the Department of Justice investigation into human trafficking because of his own ties to the company.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And that sort of brings me, I want to just pause and say, in a few minutes, we will be answering questions. So if you have any questions for Saket, please put them into the chat and we'll get to those in just a few minutes. And in the book, you talk about what I think of as like this villain origin story. And the man who created this human trafficking scheme for this company started out as an immigration attorney. And I mean, you've said throughout our conversation that this was an entirely plotted scheme, that they never intended to, give these men anything that they told them they were going to give them. It was all just a scheme to line pockets with millions of dollars, and it went into the government. They were lining pockets of people in the government to allow them to do this. So can you talk about his story? I mean, I just, how does one go from championing labor causes to basically creating a slave labor camp?
Well, this is one of the most fascinating figures that I've ever encountered, and certainly one of the most interesting characters to write in the book. This is a gentleman named Malvern Burnett who grew up in Louisiana, thinking of himself as the immigrant's best friend. And he really was, for a long time, an idealist and protector and defender of immigrants. It started when he was a kid. When he was a little boy, his Catholic parents took in a pair of Cuban refugees in Louisiana. It was part of their Catholicism. And little Malvern literally looked up to them. He was, 6 years old, 8 years old. They were tall teenagers. Malvern told me of how they would, talk about them long after the refugees left. They would talk at the dinner table about these refugees. They left a huge mark on his life. They taught him how to play baseball. They shaped his childhood. And even though they left, he carried them with him all the way to law school. And after that, started an immigration law practice. But then Katrina hit his family and his house. And I think that changed his financial circumstances. And he took this extraordinary power he had around immigration, and he used it for, nefarious purposes. He entered into a Faustian bargain with a Mississippi cop to sell a human trafficking scheme to a large oil rig builder.
Wow. That's just, it's a stunning story to me, because I think, the whole point of slavery is devaluing the humanity, and to start from a place where you not only see the people as human, but admire them, and then flip into this evil. I was fascinated. Anyway.
He is a fascinating figure. I mean, they all are, the ICE agent, the attorney. Part of what I hoped is conveyed in the book is that they're all very complex people. It's not just a simple story of good guys versus bad guys. It's a complex set of interests in a really crazy economy, and people are turning and being converted, and there's the push and pull. And in the middle of the book, even my closest friend in the book, Rajan, the man with whom I cooked these glorious meals, turns on me and turns on the campaign because of the pressure he faces. So it's not a straight line. And, I think we don't know ourselves as well as we think sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, let's turn to some questions. Let's see, from Karen, how much experience with immigration did you have as a labor organizer? You knew a lot about immigration law. Were you learning it during the process, or were you already familiar with the process before you started dealing with these men?
Well, what I had was a lot of life experience. I came to the United States as a foreign student from India. I was an immigrant. I came to Chicago. And in fact, I think my parents in India were the first parents in the history of India to let their child go to the United States to study theater. That's what I was doing in Chicago. And I was running a theater company when I missed an immigration deadline and became undocumented. So I spent time as an undocumented immigrant. This was after 9/11. And so I had my own lived experience of the difficulties of that. And so I think that gave me a basis of connecting with the men. At the same time, we were very different. I was English speaking. I had a college degree. These men, were quite different. They're, my slipping into a state of being undocumented was nothing as dramatic as stealing out of a labor camp.
Right.
They had to do that in the middle of the night. I think my lived experience was part of my training on immigration. And then, as a labor organizer, when you organize immigrants, you really have to know labor, but you really also have to know immigration, particularly since, companies like the one in the book use immigration status as a weapon, as
Right.
one more mechanism of control. So you really have to understand all those tools.
Right. Okay, this is a little bit long with multi-parts, but I think it all fits together in the end. Why do you think that so many people were imprisoned on this company's property for so long, were not noticed and or reported to authorities? Didn't like the townspeople notice? What about the Walmart workers? What about other workers at the factory? Was there a factory? And then the second part is how many people died or returned to India or received green cards or stayed in the US? I think that's sort of part of that is answered in the last part of the book, which we're making people go read for themselves, like how it all ends. But let you answer that. Like, why didn't anybody else notice that they were there and report them?
Well, the genius of the scheme in part was that the company was able to build a labor camp on its property behind its walls so that it would keep workers hidden. So the town of Pascagoula largely didn't experience these workers. The surrounding cities didn't really experience these workers. These men were hidden from view. Now, they did take chaperoned trips in a company van to a church on Sundays. They were taken to Walmart once or twice a month to shop. But there they looked like newly arrived immigrants shopping. They piled back up into the van. The van took them straight back to the labor camp, but nobody knew.
Right.
I interviewed a number of the guards for the book. One of them is a character in the book. And, the guards themselves, the security guards, they had a sense that not everything was right. They saw the men sleeping and how they were living. They themselves were exploited by the company. So I think this is also part of it is, this is in part a book about how we sometimes look away from injustice. And a lot of people looked away.
So, and last question, what did the company plan to do with the men after they were finished with the jobs?
Oh, the company planned to have the men complete extraordinarily lucrative contracts, and when
Right.
they were done, to have them sent back to India.
Just have them deported.
In essence, yes.
Wow. Ooh, okay. I want to thank you, Saket, so much for joining us this evening. It's
Thank you
been,
for having me.
oh, it's been such a pleasure. And before we go, perhaps you could talk about the Resilience Force, of which is the organization that you founded, and let our audience know how they can help you with your efforts. Because this
Sure.
is not an isolated incident by any means. And Signal Company, this corporation, is still in business, right?
Well, a federal jury found the company and its recruiters liable for human trafficking, forced labor, and many other things. Soon afterwards, Signal declared bankruptcy.
Oh,
So the same people are operating a new company under a new name in the same place.
oh,
But there was some measure of justice. The men are still here. They are now reunited with their families. The young man I talked about, Ebi Raju, who had to wait 3 years to see his newborn child, went and stood. There's a beautiful scene at the end of the book where he's in the Atlanta airport, and up the escalator comes his wife with a 3-year-old child in tow. Ebi is holding a toy, a yellow excavator, very nervously, hoping to bribe his little kid, his 3-year-old son, to come into his arms. But the kid doesn't even need the toy. Ebi's son leaps into his father's arms in a gorgeous reunion. So there were these beautiful moments at the end, because the U.S. government vindicated the men's claims. The question about the company and the men, part of what happened was that what I didn't know at the time, was that these men were actually the first of many workers, many immigrant workers who would fix up cities and schools and businesses in the midst of climate change. After Hurricane Katrina, there were 15 years of hurricanes, 200 billion-dollar disasters. And each time immigrant workers were the ones, just like these men, new waves of immigrant workers who would rebuild. So Resilience Force is an organization of those workers. We founded an organization to be the national voice of what we call the resilience workforce, the people who are the white blood cells of American recovery. In California, for example, we're working really deeply with the workers who are making it possible to survive floods and fires, who do preparation before and the repairing afterwards. So we're the voice of this workforce, and you can support us by going to www.resilienceforce.org.
okay, and we will drop that link into the chat. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. And I remind the audience that the book, The Great Escape, is available at our local bookstore, Books Inc. on Park Street. And there is a link in the chat where you can order it from them and go pick it up, or have it shipped to you. Thank you, Saket. We have some excellent, I'm sorry, like,
no, just saying thank you for having me.
so much fun. So we have some excellent Friends at Home programs coming up. On Wednesday, July 26th at 7 p.m., we have The Tudors, Art and Majesty in Renaissance England by one of our favorite docents, Marcia Holm. Marcia has been a docent with the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco since 1979. Our next author event will be just the next day, Thursday, July 27th, also at 7. We will be talking to Mia Manasala about her book, Arsenic and Adobo. So watch our website, newsletter, and Facebook page for additional events and to register. All of our events are free, but please consider a donation to Friends of the Alameda Free Library at alamedafriends.com or via the QR code on the screen, which will show up in a moment, which will allow us to continue to sponsor events such as these. A special recognition to those who helped make this happen: David Beal, Karen Romer, Karen Manuel, and Billy Reisenschmidt. And a special thanks to Saket for an outstanding program. Finally, thanks to you for joining us tonight. Good night.